Hey everyone, James from the Flying Guillotine here, today bringing you another review of Il Boss, 1973. This is the first Italian crime film, Eurocrime, polizioteschi, whatever you want to call it, that I'm bringing onto this film, but it is a genre that is near and dear to my heart. I love these films, very much like I enjoy giallo films or heroic bloodshed or martial arts films from Hong Kong. So as a lover of genre cinema, this is definitely one of my genres, and maybe the one that's lesser seen of those different films. And in many ways kind of like the natural successor to the spaghetti westerns that came out in the 60s. So this genre was really, really popular in the 70s and 80s. Going to be spoiling this film, but it's definitely one of my favorites. So if you haven't seen it, the short review is go check it out. It's fantastic if you are a fan of kind of these crime films. If you like a lot of those bloodshed films in the 80s, these films tend to be a little bit less action-oriented, but they are great fun nonetheless. Yeah, so let's get into it. The synopsis is a hitman finds himself embroiled in the middle of a mafia war between the Sicilians and the Calabrians. So this one is a part of a three-film trilogy by Fernando Di Leo, who directed all three, called the Milieu trilogy. He sort of got his start as a screenwriter, worked on Fistful of Dollars and A Few Dollars More, of course those Sergio Leone films, before kind of graduating onto directing. And he's definitely most well known for these sort of polizioteschi films in the 70s. Kind of had a fairly short career for 10 or 15 years, that his golden years were relatively short, and I think the heights of his career are usually considered these three films, Caliber 9, Italian Connection, and The Boss. The Boss comes last. It's kind of the least acclaimed of those three, but I think all three are fantastic. I think he's also done a number of other really good films. I'm a big fan of Shoot First, Die Later. Kidnap Syndicate is also great, Blood and Diamonds, and even Killer vs. Killer I'm a fan of. So I'm in general a pretty big Fernando Di Leo fan, and particularly this era of his films. So film to film, Iñaki and I, when we were talking about these different movies, this is actually kind of one of the genres that inspired me to want to just have that podcast and just have that outlet to basically make someone else watch these films with me so I can talk about them. So I was glad that Iñaki liked most of those films, but wanted to also talk about these, especially now that we haven't brought a polizioteschi on in quite some time. So I did talk about the other two parts of those trilogies on there, so go check those out. Caliber 9 and Italian Connection, both personal favorites of mine. Italian Connection in particular, I really, that might be my favorite Eurocrime film. I just love the simplicity of it and the way that it's really well executed. So those two films are actually based off of short stories by the same author. This one is based off of an American pulp novel that you don't see a whole lot about, Il Mafioso. I think it just came out a year or two before. Of course, this is coming a year or two after The Godfather as well. So, and I think compared to the other two films in the trilogy, the Milieu trilogy, this is definitely far more of a syndicate mafia mob movie. A lot of what happens is kind of like the interworkings behind the scenes between the different clans, the Sicilians and the Calabrians. This film is also set in Palermo, which is the big city in Sicily. So in that sense, it's set in southern Italy, whereas his other films were set usually in Milan or in northern or central Italy, somewhere else. So as a result, it does have a fairly different feel. Another thing that's going to be pretty obvious to anyone that watches this, despite having one character actor come over from it, these films look totally different from The Godfather. There might be some influence, or maybe the fact is The Godfather maybe had sort of like a booming fiction, pulp fiction from sort of the success of that Mario Puzo novel and the film The Godfather done by Coppola. But this film is just very, very different from it. Those films take their time. They're epic films. They are long. Polizioteschi is not epic. This is maybe one of the longest polizioteschi films out there, and it runs an hour and 49. And I think if it were up to me, I probably would have cut another 15 minutes or so from it. I think these films are very much not epics, and I think that might be another reason why these films haven't caught on in the same way as some of those dollars the spaghetti westerns have, or the giallo films. The spaghetti westerns in particular, they have a couple films that are legitimately just very epic films that scream ambition and stuff like that. And these poliziotteschi are very much B movies. They are usually 90 minutes, 95 minutes, 85 minutes, show you all the good stuff, kind of distilled down to its essences, and then it's over. So in that sense, it's very similar to a lot of these kind of Hong Kong films coming out in the 70s and the 80s, very much intended to have a number of showings throughout the day, and they're very conscientious of that. Let's not try to invent the wheel, and let's just try to show what people want to see and get out. So in that sense, I think it cuts out a lot of the flab and stuff like that you would get. So it almost has all of those inner machinations of something like The Godfather without, and just cuts out kind of all the in-between scenes. And I love The Godfather. I think The Godfather is a stone-cold masterpiece. But there is something to be said for some of these pulp things, and I think it certainly has its merits as well. Another thing that I think is kind of interesting about these poliziotteschi too is I've seen a lot of them at this point. I've seen around 150 or so. I've been keeping an active list on Letterboxd. And once you get on to like a certain amount, you start to... the caliber of the film can often go down. And I have seen some good stuff still at 141, 142. Like you will still occasionally come across a fairly good one. But coming back to Il Boss, which is just a really good, really well done movie, there can be quite a night and day difference between some like the 150th poliziotteschi you watch versus something that is just like a classic of that genre of films. So this film is just very well done, and I think it brings a lot more to the table than kind of just those essences. For instance, one thing that I think is fairly interesting about the film is that Di Leo, his background is as a writer, and I was struck by how good some of the writing is in this film. Tarantino has mentioned Di Leo a few times and is kind of responsible for sort of bringing Di Leo into the public view with shouting out bits, specifically Caliber 9 and I think the Milieu trilogy. I'm not sure when he did that exactly, but he's talked openly about how he likes these. And it takes a little bit of thinking, at least it did for me, to sort of see those connections into how Di Leo might have influenced Tarantino, especially his first three films, Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, and Jackie Brown. And I think a lot of it is in the creation of sort of this really colorful underworld. Di Leo, like Tarantino, likes to come up with like kind of clever names for people and things. There's a thing here called the Oven, which is basically just this big guy that burns corpses or even live people. Probably you have to pay a little bit more if you go to him and you bring a live human that you want him to burn alive. And so you see these references and stuff like that of like taking to the oven, and there's just also a lot of trash talking and shit talking that's going on, and just helps to create kind of like this little bit of a richer, more interesting, fun canvas. And I think you see a little bit of that in Tarantino as well. A final thing I did want to highlight that does seem like it might be a bit of a Tarantino influence, although, you know, this could come from a lot of places too, is that the violence of the Di Leo films often comes very sudden and oftentimes is over very, very fast. So they're not really like extended action set pieces like you're going to see out of Hong Kong or something like that. They are very violent, and they're often over really fast. And oftentimes Tarantino's films, especially early in his career, are kind of the same way. And in that sense, it also does remind me a little bit of Ringo Lam, in the sense that anything, the violence is just kind of simmering right under the surface, and it can explode at any moment. There's even a couple of car explosions here that did remind me of Ringo Lam. So of course those influences could come from a number of places. Di Leo certainly and poliziotteschi certainly didn't invent exploding cars or anything like that, but I do see a little bit of a similar strand of DNA running through those films as well. Okay, so if I were to kind of sum up what makes this film work, is I would say it is just the Henry Silva show. If you're not familiar with Henry Silva, he's not necessarily a great actor, but he is such a great presence, and he's sort of one of those people where you see him and you see him on screen for even just a minute, and you're like, who is this guy? Like, who is this guy? He has just like a dark, piercing, super intense look. Not a ton of range in this. He's always playing some sort of very tough ass dude, and he's just he's not a star, but he has that sort of presence where you are just immediately drawn to him, and you're wondering, what is this guy's deal? And he just has this certain intensity, and I think this is the perfect vehicle for him, kind of being this hitman that is basically trying to navigate this war between the two different clans, and there's like constant betrayals coming from both sides, and Henry Silva is pretty much kind of an immovable object. This film has one of my absolute favorite openers, period. Not even just from this genre, period. Where he takes a bazooka and he goes into a porno theater where there's a bunch of like old, greasy Italian mob bosses getting ready to watch a porno together. There's like about 10 of them in there. And he just goes into the projection room, kicks the people out, takes out a bazooka, and blows them to shreds. And that's how the film opens. And not only that, after he does that, he continues to use the bazooka for another shot in relatively close quarters before finally taking out a normal gun and kind of going to work that way. And then the music just drops, which is this magnificent Louis Bacalov score. And it's just, it needs to be seen to be believed. So even if you don't want to watch the whole film, you can even find this short sequence on YouTube. Just watch the beginning of Il Boss. It is one of a kind, and it is definitely one of the absolute best conceptions of a sequence. Sadly, I don't know if the film ever quite tops that, although the ending is quite good too. It is just a really, really fantastic sequence. Yeah, the rest of the film is kind of just a series of very noir-like betrayals of one another, specifically between the two clans. Silva is one of the chess pieces being played in there, sort of a higher level chess piece, but not the top chess piece. So Richard Kante plays one of the mafia bosses here, who of course is also known from The Godfather. You actually have him and one of the other mafia guys is in The Godfather as well, one of those Italian character actors, a little bit of a heavier set fellow. And so you do have a little bit of that Godfather connection here, but again, a totally different film from The Godfather. There's a montage of deaths here. We get to see people tossed into the furnace. This film is just very much distilled into a bunch of violence and stuff like that. I almost wish that they reduced the amount of like betrayals back and forth there, just because it does get a little bit long in the tooth, and I do think this film runs a little bit long for what it is. But you do sort of see shreds of Yojimbo, Fistful of Dollars, sort of those films, in the way that different people are played. I think it comes off a little bit differently because you have less of a master plan, or like the Ronin in between, or like the Clint Eastwood character in Fistful of Dollars playing both sides off each other. But it does kind of have that feel of like a back and forth, and you're not totally sure which side you're necessarily rooting for. I guess you're kind of rooting for Henry Silva's character, Lanzetta, but not necessarily so. You're kind of more or less an observer here. Another thing is this film is just very, very cynical. There is really, they will talk about loyalty and stuff like that, but there is no loyalty in this film. Everyone is really out for themselves. And in that sense, it kind of reminds me a little bit of an Umberto Lenzi film, in the sense that it's just very, very misanthropic. And there's a lot of cynicism here. I think Di Leo kind of has a sharper, especially in this part of his career, he's a little bit sharper to the point than Lenzi. And so Lenzi's films often end up feeling like romps, whereas Di Leo's I do feel like are a little bit more pointed. I like Lenzi. He's not my absolute favorite, though. So I would think this film is probably better than any of the Italian crime films that Umberto Lenzi does. Personally, that's what I believe, at least. Yeah, another thing that you'll see mentioned throughout this genre is it's very associated with sort of like these sort of right-wing, Dirty Harry-like cops, most notably played by Maurizio Merli, who's basically playing like this supercharged Dirty Harry in a number of film. So just like a really, really tough cop that needs to work against the system. So as a result, those films come off as quite right-wing and debatably fascist at times. So that's part of sort of like the political background during this time, which takes place during like this time of like a lot of just violence and political violence going on in Italy. It's called the Years of Lead. But this one, I feel like Di Leo doesn't necessarily have that sort of feeling of coming off really, really pro-cop. Very few of his films focus on police as the center point, and when they do, the police are often very corrupt. So I don't think he necessarily has those same sort of like, I have a hard time seeing the criticism of him being accused a fascist or right-wing or anything like that here. One thing that is kind of funny about this film is that the corpses of the mafia bosses that were killed, he named them all Christian democratic politicians. So he is certainly also not one to shy away from the politics either. So not saying he's apolitical either. Also, the head cop here is kind of portrayed as a joke. He's kind of the comic relief, and I think that says something when you're making one of like your top policemen just basically be kind of a running joke here. Another thing that's interesting too is I don't think you can really call Di Leo properly, or at least if he is left-wing, he is criticizing the left-wing too. There are constant references to sort of like the politics of the time, Vietnam, and those sorts of things. And the rich kid in this film, the daughter, is basically portrayed as very, very spoiled. And she's sort of like, she is a nymphomaniac. And so when she is kidnapped and stuff like that, the contrast between her father, who's trying really, really hard to get her back and making payments and sacrifices like that, and his daughter, who basically just doesn't give a shit and doesn't care about him. It's an interesting twist on sort of like that kidnapping genre, kidnapping subplot, I should say. Yeah, so I think the rich kids and left-wing anti-protesters and hippies, not necessarily portrayed in a super great way either, in the sense that the hippies seem often like very privileged, wealthy children too. Whereas like the working class people are kind of like more just low-life criminals in this too. Okay, so a couple things I was amused by. The Henry Silva decor, which is a bunch of like naked ladies behind his bed, is just kind of funny to see, especially when he eventually does rescue the daughter and brings her to his place. And she is mainly nude all the time too, but then she has a bunch of like pictures of naked ladies behind her as well. So I thought that was kind of funny. I definitely recommend this film. I think Henry Silva is fantastic in it. I would say it has a grade A opening and a really, really good conclusion too. I think those are probably like the two most notable parts. It does have some nice twists and turns in it that I think mainly work. Like I think like the middle part of this movie is like a B or B plus, like really, really solid, but maybe not quite up to the promise of the beginning and the end. The conclusion is we have a number of violent showdowns, and one in Nick Lanzetta's apartment, and the other one in sort of like where a person needs to work his way out of a mafia don's headquarters. So the intrigue is quite good, but not always the best. And I think it does run a little long to it too. And I think this film too would benefit from having a little bit of a stronger second lead to it. I think Caliber 9 really benefited from having Gaston Moshin plays the lead there, who's good, but it benefits from having a very strong, very energetic Mario Adorf presence as the secondary character. And Italian Connection stars Mario Adorf, and it has a really strong Silva and Woody Strode performance as sort of the villains in that film. In this film, I think Henry Silva is totally up to it, and I think he's fantastic, and he does what he does in this film. But I don't think it quite has that secondary character. In theory, it should be Richard Kante, but he's really old. He's towards the end of his life at this point, and I don't think he necessarily gives the energetic burst that's needed. I think he's quite good as sort of like that understated mafia boss, and he's obviously a very accomplished actor. But in terms of like bringing that just sort of jolt of energy that you're going to need if you're going to sustain this 110-minute runtime, that'd be my criticism of it as well. Interestingly, too, another one of those Eurocrime classics, Almost Human, Henry Silva plays the head cop in there. Richard Kante was originally supposed to play that. So it's kind of weird to think those two being up for like this same Dirty Harry type cop. In fact, it's hard to see either one of them being supernatural in that role, but I do have an easier time seeing Silva do it, who eventually ended up in that role. So it's kind of, I don't know, they're just very, very two dramatically different presences in the movie. Who won the movie? As much as I love Di Leo, I think I think you have to give it to Henry Silva in here. Just really, really strong performance. If you're a fan of him, this is absolutely essential. If you're a fan of Eurocrime, absolutely essential. If you're a fan of Italian genre film and want to check out Eurocrime, this one's good. I would say any of the Milieu trilogy is worth checking out, and I would say this one should definitely be on the list. I don't think it's the best poliziotteschi, but probably in the top 20 or so. Top 10 or 20. So yeah, rating wise, going to give this an 8 out of 10. Just a damn solid film. A little bit of flab there in the middle, but I'd say this one is well worth checking out. Yeah, so thank you all for tuning in. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see more, and I'll see you all next time.